Thank you for tuning in to the webinar premiere of Create a Smart Plan of Action and Milestones for NIST SP 800-171 compliance, followed after by a live Q&A. IBSS is honored to have you join us for this special session hosted by our own Nijel Redrick. For over 15 years, Nijel has dedicated his career to evaluating and enhancing the implementation of security and privacy controls. His focus has been on creating strong cybersecurity frameworks, developing effective risk management strategies, and empowering teams to defend their organizations against the constantly changing cyber threats we face today. Nijel is a proud graduate of Howard University, where he earned his degree in mathematics. He also brings an impressive array of professional certifications, including Certified Information Systems Auditor, Certified Information Systems Security Professional, Project Management Professional, and Certified Cloud Security Professional. Now, let's get started.
Hello. Today we're going to talk about how to create a SMART plan of action and milestones for NIST SP 800-171 compliance. SMART meaning specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. Our agenda, we're going to talk about the POA&M and its purpose, give you a brief overview of POA&Ms, how to create a SMART POA&M, going to actually utilize a scenario based on a NIST 800-171 Rev 3 requirement, and to provide the elements that are necessary for a SMART POA&M. In 2001, OMB issued Memorandum 0124 that required the heads of agencies to provide strategies to correct security weaknesses. And such strategies had to include a plan of action and milestones, or POA&M. Later on that year, due to numerous requests from several agencies, OMB issued additional guidance and specified the mandatory reporting requirements, and also emphasized the importance of keeping POA&Ms confidential, because keep in mind that a POA&M is about addressing weaknesses. Consequently, we want to make sure that those weaknesses are not in the wrong hands. So what is the definition of a POA&M? So what we have on the screen verbatim from OMB Memorandum 0201 is the definition. And certainly it is a tool that should be utilized anytime we have identified a weakness. The POA&M is a tool that identifies the tasks that are needed to address the weakness. And it details the resources required to accomplish the objectives of the POA&M. Now, I do not like referring to people as resources. However, in the context of the POA&M, people do fall under that heading. Resources include people, technology, funding, anything else that's needed to accomplish the objective. Also has something called the milestones. That's in the name of the plan of action and milestones. And those milestones are the steps that are necessary to complete the task at hand. And quite importantly would be any scheduled completion dates for those milestones. Now, the ultimate purpose of the POA&M certainly is to identify and assess, prioritize, and monitor the progress toward addressing the objectives of that POA&M. When do we create a POA&M, or when is the most appropriate time to do so? Organizations should create POA&Ms when, one, and as it relates to 800-171, when an organization is unable to fulfill an 800-171 requirement in accordance with the expected timeline. Now, that timeline could be an internal timeline based on the company's objectives. It could be a timeline based on a contractual requirement. So in the event that a company is unable, or organization is unable to meet a requirement, a POA&M should be created. Sometimes a company, I say sometimes, but companies should pretty regularly conduct internal assessments. And it's quite possible that during that internal assessment, a company recognizes that a requirement is not being met. And in that instance, a POAM should be created. And similarly, it should be created if the requirement cannot be addressed within the expected timeline. And again, that timeline can be an internal deadline or one that is imposed upon the organization by some external entity. And there are other reasons for creating a POAM. With CMMC right around the corner, there's a potential that an external assessor might determine that a weakness has been identified that the company did not know about. So in that instance, it is incumbent upon the company to create a POAM to address that weakness. And if you notice, I keep referring to the expected timeline. Sometimes a POAM can be, or a weakness can be addressed in a very timely manner. We could say in a week or two. In those instances, it might not be necessary to develop a POAM. But in the event that's going to take, let's say, months or even next calendar year, it is necessary to create a POAM. And sometimes, as contractors know, we do get contract modifications, and that contract modification could necessitate um, a change in our environment, and it could require us to create a POAM to meet that new contract modification, or there could be a new regulation that comes about. And in that instance, if we're unable to meet that regulatory requirement, um, again, in accordance with the expected timeline, we should create a POAM. So more about this SMART POAM. So for those of us who are accustomed to goal setting, we are familiar with the SMART acronym. So as it relates to a POAM, we want to make sure that we perform a root cause analysis, and then we are very specific about the cause of the weakness, and we clearly document that weakness. That's where the specificity comes into play. As it relates to being measurable, we want our milestones to be written in such a way that when communicated, decision makers understand the progress is being made towards completing the milestones. Achievable. Um, this is where a lot of organizations um, fail, quite honestly, making their POAMs achievable. Well, what does that entail? Number one, you want to make sure you have the personnel on staff who can take care of any of the tasks that are assigned. And if personnel are not on staff, then a couple of ideas need to be thrown around. Do you outsource it, the task, or do you could even say, well, I'm going to just totally outsource the POAM totally, right? But what we're talking about here is in the event that an entity would like, or an organization would like to address the POAM on their own, you certainly want to make sure that you have the personnel on staff. That's just one part of it. We also want to make sure there's funding available. You can have the personnel, but if there's no funding, just in case a new tool is necessary, you want to make sure that's in place also. You also want to make sure that the milestones are relevant. Um, Too often, I've seen where POAMs include um, milestones that are, I wouldn't say not applicable to addressing the weakness. So you want to make sure that each of those milestones are relevant to addressing the weakness and will ultimately lead to closing the POAM. And lastly, the POAM, it must be time bound. And as we recall from the OMB requirement, we must have a scheduled completion date. So we want to make sure that each of our milestones have a specific date in mind. So we've created a scenario for you based on a Rev 3 requirement. So IBSS, in the process developing its SSP, the ISO determines that there's no solution in place for requirement 3.3.1 or event logging, and a POAM would be needed to address that weakness. So here we provided for you the requirements from 80171 Rev 3 for event logging. Number one, the organization must specify the events that will be logged by the system. The second requirement is to review and update those events based on an organizational defined frequency. And now we're going to go into detail about developing a SMART POA&M, looking at each one of the attributes associated with the SMART acronym. So, in regards to being specific, certainly want to determine the root cause of the weakness and clearly document that weakness. So we determined in the scenario that IBSS does not have an audit and accountability policy. And also we determined that there is no event logging solution in place. Next, the milestones should be written in such a way that management or anybody can easily track progress towards completion, and you are able to communicate such progress. So the first milestone that we have, because we recall from the scenario in that the events must be defined. Well, the best way to define events is a policy. Um, the requirement also stated that those events should be reviewed and updated based on an organization defined, um, not policy, but organization defined requirement. Well, again, a policy is the ideal mechanism to accomplish that. So, what we're going to do here is to assign personnel to write and disseminate an audit and accountability policy. Next, we need to make sure that we assign personnel who will actually be involved in deploying an event logging solution. And the personnel need to be knowledgeable and capable and have the expertise to configure and deploy an event logging solution. And also need to have funding allocated. In addition to the funding, that's one step, but actually have to purchase the event logging solution. And then next, from an operational standpoint, the engineers need to configure the solution in order to capture the events that have been specified in the in the audit and accountability policy. And then the event logging solution should be tested and ultimately deployed. Now, if we look at each of those, where we have their milestones, they are measurable because we can tell whether or not somebody has been assigned and whether or not the policy has been disseminated. Um, we can also determine whether or not we have assigned somebody on staff who is knowledgeable, has the ability and expertise to configure and deploy the solution. We can also tell readily whether or not funding has been allocated and whether or not the solution has been purchased. We can also determine whether or not the solution has been configured. We can, as a part of testing, there's a test plan. There are test results. We know whether or not testing took place. And lastly, accountability policy. Achievable. Now, notice here that our milestones are repeating themselves, but what we're doing is highlighting the attributes of a SMART POA&M. As it relates to being achievable, we want to make sure that the personnel have the requisite expertise. Um, that is a pitfall, and sometimes organizations, I understand the need to try to work within, but sometimes organizations don't have the expertise on hand. So a critical component of a technological solution or any solution is making sure we have the personnel on staff. Um, in order to make our POA&M achievable, We also make sure we have the funding in place. Certainly, we have the personnel there, but there's no funding allocated for the solution, then that will impact our ultimate achievement. Relevant. So let's take a look at our milestones again. We want to make sure that all of these milestones are relevant to addressing the objectives of our POAM. Certainly, assigning personnel to write and disseminate an audit accountability policy, um, assigning personnel to configure and deploy the solution, allocating funding and purchasing the solution, configuring the solution, testing solution, and deploying it. All of those, I think we can agree, are relevant. Time bound. We want to make sure that each of our milestones have a start date and a finish date. That makes it time bound. So we're going to start writing our audit and accountability policy on October 17th, 2024, and we will start disseminating it on November 15th, 2024. Now, what does that time allow? That time allows for the drafting of the policy, the review of the policy, and publishing it. And then we're going to make sure that we assign personnel to do the work. And we only have 1 day for that. Why is that? Because it doesn't take a long time to assign someone to actually configure, test, and deploy the solution. And then we allocated about a month for, I don't want to use the word allocate. We have scheduled about a month to look at allocating funding and purchasing an event logging solution. That approximately month time frame allows for the meetings to take place and any other types of budgetary discussions that take place at the organizational level. Continue with additional POAMs. Um, so after the funding has been allocated and the tool has been, the event logging solution or tool has been purchased, we set aside a couple of months to actually configure the solution because remember that configuration must comply with policy. So this is not an overnight type of activity. After the solution is configured, we set aside about 1 work week to test the solution, and then about another work week to actually deploy it into the enterprise environment. Now, here are some very critical POAM elements that an organization should ensure that each POAM has. Number one, a POAM ID. Now, this is just a made up POAM ID. Have 871. That is the, we'll say maybe the source of or the regulation trying to comply with. And this POAM is tied to requirement 3.3.1. But organizationally, you can create any POAM ID you want using any type of um, symbols, is up to you. But you want to make sure that your POAM IDs are unique, meaning you can't have the same POAM ID for multiple POAMs. We have something here called approved. We want our POAM to be approved by management because that means that management has understands the funding associated with it. Management understands the personnel associated with it. That demonstrates that type of governance that is necessary to make that POAM even more achievable. You want to give the POAM a title, and the title should be representative of the weakness. Now let's talk about cost. So the cost that we have here is $500,000. And some people might think that's a lot. Some colleagues say it's not enough. Um, One of the things to keep in mind with POAM cost, it is not just a product. Because remember, you can buy a product, but somebody has to do something with that product. So your POAM cost should also include personnel cost. So um, with respect to our POAM, this POAM covers the personnel associated with writing the policy and disseminating the policy. It involves the personnel associated with um, allocating the funding and purchasing the solution, and also the personnel who will be configuring, um, testing, and deploying solution. All of that. So based on that, you might say it might be $1 million. I mean, it depends on your organizational structure. You also want to have a POAM creation date. That helps everybody know when the POAM is created and helps to track it. And when we say it's created on October 7th, let's say we don't have a creation date. Let's go with that. Without a creation date, you cannot properly track that POAM, right? So you want to make sure you understand when the POAM is created. And then we next get to the POAM scheduled start date, which is a difference between the creation date. In this instance, we did create the POAM on the 17th, and we also started it on the 17th. That's because we understand internally um, the everybody's schedule. We say, okay, we can get started on the 17th. However, let's say we create the POAM on the 17th, but you can't get started for whatever reason until December 15th. That's fine also. But the main idea is to have a POAM creation date and a scheduled start date. And the last date of importance is the POAM scheduled completion date. Now, that scheduled completion date, that's our goal, right? That that helps management to understand ultimately when they can expect to see that solution in place, or that rather that POAM totally addressed. In our instance, that means by January 28, 2025, the POAM policy has been documented and disseminated, and the solution has been deployed. And the last critical element is the POAM status. So in our case, the POAM status is on track. Um, if for whatever reason we get to January 29th and we've still not accomplished our objective, then we'll use a status called, you can call it delayed or overdue. But these are some pretty critical elements that are necessary for our POAM in order to communicate these requirements to management. Now what we've done is we've created a sample POAM that your organization can utilize, sample template, so to speak. We have 6 milestones, and these milestones are not unfamiliar to you. You've seen them. We've just now organized them in somewhat of a template format. So our first milestone, as we've talked about, to assign and direct personnel to write and disseminate their audit accountability policy. You've seen the start and finish date, but then who's assigned to that milestone? That is a critical component that we've talked about before. That helps to make our POAM achievable, right? So we want to make sure we have the correct people in place to do the work. Um, so I'm not going to read through each of these milestones, but what I did want to point out is that each milestone has a number, and that helps with communication purposes, right? Because if you're referring to milestone number 2 or milestone number 5, without a milestone number, it makes it difficult to communicate. Not impossible, but difficult to communicate. So just to reiterate there, we want to make sure that our milestones are numbered. And again, that eases communication. Each milestone should have a start date, not even should. Each milestone must have a start date and must have a finish date. And lastly, each milestone must have one or more persons assigned to accomplish that particular objective. And one of the reasons why we have that assignment is in case there's a question. You want to go to that person to ask about the status, especially if we get to that overdue status. You know, we say we want our POAM completed by January 28th, 2025. Um, we do want to make sure that our that if in the event that is beyond that date, that we can kind of go look at the milestones and find out who we should speak with about the delays. Well, thank you for joining today's presentation, and be sure to click the QR code to get our NIST SPH 171 white paper, and join us in November for our next live presentation, where we're going to talk about how to conduct a risk assessment. You don't want to miss that one. And be sure to send us an email at NIST underscore SP800 171 at ibsscorp.com for a free consultation. And thanks again for watching. Stay tuned for the live Q&A. Hello, and welcome to today's live Q&A. I see we have some questions here in the queue. So question, let's see, the first question we have here. If we leverage a cloud service provider and they have a control weakness, do we need to create a POAM? In this instance, if the weakness is solely on the part of the CSP or the cloud service provider, we do not need to create a POAM. However, if that weakness associated with the provider is so egregious, it might be necessary to migrate or change to another provider. And in that situation, it is a recommendation to create a plan of action to migrate away from that CSP. But in most instances, it is not necessary to create a POAM due to the weakness or due to weakness on the part of a CSP. Next question. What happens if a POAM deadline is missed? Well, that depends. Um, your organizational policy will dictate um, POAM deadlines and how you handle those. However, if you have a deadline that's been imposed upon you by a regulatory body, the regulatory body would specify any penalties. Now, I must say that some penalties could result in a loss of revenue, especially if it's a contractual requirement to fulfill a requirement by a certain deadline. Next question. What if we have a lack of funding? Now that's a great question. The other two are good too, but that question there about a lack of funding is quite common. Um, Quite honestly, the lack of funding is really no excuse. Kind of crass to say that. Um, Security should be built in. Um, that way, we're not building or bolting security on at the end. And quite often, that's where the lack of funding comes from due to the lack of planning. Um, but if there is a lack of funding, the organization needs to do all that it can to allocate the funds to address the risk, especially for any high risk vulnerabilities or weaknesses. Now, for those weaknesses that the organization has determined to be relatively low risk, then the lack of funding is not as paramount in that situation. Next question. For control deficiencies that require a long-term remediation strategy, how do you recommend breaking them down into manageable, SMART-based tasks in the POAM? So I'll read that question again. For control deficiencies that require a long-term remediation strategy, how do you recommend breaking them down into manageable, SMART-based tasks in the POAM? My recommendation is, well, first we have to define what long-term is. Sometimes a POAM or a requirement or regulation may uh, restrict that time. So while we may say long term to be 2 years, but you could have a regulatory body who says that the POAM must be resolved in 1 year. But let's say, all things being considered, that the long term remediation strategy is within an agreed upon timeline. My recommendation would be to break one POAM up into multiple POAMs. So you just have a couple or, two or three mini projects, so to speak. So I would say that's probably the best course of action. Identify some areas where you can start one part of the POAM and finish, and then kind of test where you are, and then start another part and test where you are. And then once you combine all on both of those POAMs together, you have resolved the issue. That would be the recommendation there. Next question. If we have more than one POAM, how do we know which POAM to complete first? POAM should be prioritized based on risk. And you want to, in this realm, you want to address your high risk weaknesses first, if at all possible. Now, of course, that goes back to um, the resources that you have at hand. Do you have the funding in place? If it requires a technological solution, is that solution in place? And as I mentioned during the recording, I don't like referring to people as resources. However, do you have the personnel on staff who can help to resolve that weakness? So again, you want to prioritize your POAMs and address the high risk weaknesses first. Next question. In your experience, what are some security requirements that organizations generally have open POAMs for? And what security requirements do organizations have a hard time implementing? As it relates to NIST SP 800-171, those requirements related to system configuration seem to be um, the most challenging to to resolve. Consequently, there's a POAM open for that, and quite often that's due to a lack of um, personnel expertise. So that I would say those are ones that are generally open. Now, to be more specific, um, those relate to configuration management. There's one particular requirement. I cannot remember the requirement number right now, but there is a configuration management requirement that states that organizations must establish some baseline security settings and monitor those settings. Now, that particular requirement um, applies to all of the IT components that process, store, or transmit controlled and classified information, or CUI. So if you can imagine, you have your servers, your switches, your routers, your firewalls, you have all these different IT components within your environment. Each of those must have settings that are established, and that establishment is based via quite commonly a DISA or a CIS benchmark. So once it's established, and then you have to document your deviations, and then you have to monitor those configuration settings on a regular basis to ensure that nothing has happened to cause a misconfiguration. So I would say the configuration management controls with that particular control is quite difficult. Another one that I found to be quite challenging for organizations is anything related to documentation. Uh, it sounds easy to say to develop a procedure or publish a procedure, but somebody has to do it. And it takes a lot of time. So, quite often, a lot of organizations have open POAMs related to the lack of documentation. And as I mentioned a few moments ago about the settings, the configuration settings, sometimes those, if you don't have an automated tool, those need to be documented. So, I've seen instances where you have open POAMs for that. And then did I answer the second question? What security requirements do organizations have a hard time implementing? The CM controls, I would say certainly. Um, Controls with the audit logging, I've seen that being a challenge for organizations. Um, I think another one would be multi-factor authentication. I've seen that one also. Next question. Are there common pitfalls to avoid when creating a POAM? Yeah, the most common pitfall that I've seen is not allocating funding, and that gets back to planning. Um, so let's say you create a POAM, and and without proper planning, you determine that, well, that's in planning, without proper consultation with the stakeholders, someone determines that it only costs $1,000 for that login solution that I mentioned in the scenario. Well, we saw that an estimate was 500,000. So if only $1,000 is allocated, certainly that POAM would not be achievable or achieved. So a common pitfall is the lack of funding. Another pitfall, um, and I've seen this too often, is where just one or two people are involved in the POAM creation process. Um, so, for example, if I'm serving as the Information System Security Officer, or the ISO, and I take it upon myself to create the POAM, let's say use a scenario provided, I create the POAM, I decide that the policy needs to be written, I decide that the security engineer needs to be the one to configure the tool, I decide that another engineer is the one who should configure, test, and deploy the tool. Well, not that the ISO is not an important person, but the ISO does not have oversight over the entire organization. So the ISO doesn't know the engineer's schedule. The ISO doesn't always know the funding available. The ISO doesn't know who can write the policies or who has the time to write the policies. So it would not be appropriate for me in that instance, or just one person, to be responsible for creating the POAM. That's a common pitfall, is not getting all the relevant stakeholders in the room to brainstorm to ensure that the POAM is achievable. Next question. Do you have to create one POAM for each control that fails? So do you have to create one POAM for each control that fails? The answer to that question is no. You do not have to create one POAM for each control that fails. Um, However, you do want to ensure that all controls that fail are accounted for um, when a POAM is necessary. So let's say you identify different controls that are similar, um, and we have a similar solution that would resolve the controls or address the control requirements. So in that case, you can create one POAM for multiple control failures. You typically create multiple POAMs for situations where uh, I think one of the earlier questions was about the long-term remediation strategy. So let's say we have one POAM that can, or one rather, one POAM that can be resolved in 2 months, and another POAM that can be resolved in 6 months. It's necessary to have, and that is probably two distinct POAMs. On the other hand, if we have two POAMs where the controls are similar in nature and they can be resolved in a similar amount of time, the same people working on the POAMs, then it makes sense to just have one POAM. Next question. How often should a POAM be revised for compliance purposes? Uh, Technically, you don't really revise POAMs for compliance purposes. Um, the only thing that you might revise would be your milestones, but it's not for compliance purposes. You're revising your milestones because you've determined that the POAM approach might not be as feasible as once thought. So you're not revising the POAM for compliance purposes. And actually, most organizations do have certain POAM components that cannot be revised. Um, for example, the POAM description normally cannot be revised because that's the reason why you create the POAM. So that cannot be revised. The Some organizations a lot frown upon revising the schedule completion date because the schedule completion date is helps to uh, govern the metrics that are used to determine how well your organization is closing POAMs. So I would say that you really don't want to revise. I've not seen any guidance where it says that you want to revise a POAM for compliance purposes. Looks like this is our last question. Does IBSS help create POAMs? Well, the easy answer is yes. IBSS uh, will certainly help your organization create POAMs. However, IBSS uh, would not do that in a vacuum. So, similar to the example that I provided earlier, where one or two people are responsible or take it upon themselves to create a POAM, you would not want IBSS to just walk in and create a POAM for you. We would need to be an integrated part of the team to understand the environment and work with all stakeholders to help create that POAM. Well, I guess that was the last question. Certainly, thank you all for watching and look forward to seeing you next month when we discuss how to conduct a risk assessment.